Welcome to the workshop, Enhancing Resilience with Nature, Translating the Science and Practice of Ecosystem Restoration into Policy. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to hear briefly from 2 panels. They're composed of some really fascinating and interesting people who have extensive experience in the subject matter. We'll also have an opportunity to ask them some questions, and there will be 3 sessions. The third session will be about policy, and some of the panelists will rejoin our group with some additional panelists. They're going to moderate a policy discussion, and that policy discussion will take the first 2 panels and look how can you convert theory and practice into policy lessons. My name is Bill Jackson. I'm the Chief Executive of Parks Victoria, and I'll be sharing the session for you today. Very simple definition of resilience is the ability of systems to cope with change and continue to develop. And perhaps the hallmark of our current century is one of change. Every day we face a wide range of changes, socioeconomic changes, environmental changes, including the emergence of new technologies, the spectre of climate change, and fluctuations in our financial markets, as the one many of us are facing at the moment. We also see the impact of demographic change and consumerism across the world, and shifting in the way our society perceives nature and uses nature. So whether we face predictable or disruptive change, sometimes unexpected change, it's a fact that our systems have to cope with, and the capacity of those systems and our human societies to adapt is one of the key elements of resilience thinking. Our first panel is going to explore the theory of resilience from a systems knowledge perspective. In particular, we're going to focus on the theory of restoring degraded ecosystems and adaptive governance to enhance resilience in socio-ecological systems. I think that's the important point, that it's not just about ecosystems, it's also about the societies that live in and use and depend on those systems. So our panel, the first panel, comprises Mark Smith, David Mann, and Joe Malongo. Mark is Director of the IUCN Global Water Program, and he's worked in many countries and also in the international policy arena. He's worked particularly on promoting and developing integrated solutions to water management. I'll introduce the other 2 as they speak, and Mark is going to give us a PowerPoint presentation. I will point out that I believe that all but one of our presentations today are going to be in English. So if English is not your first language, you're welcome to use the headphones. There is translation. Angela, who will be talking to us in the second panel, will be speaking in Spanish, and I'll remind you of that again so that you're all ready for that. Mark.
Great, thank you very much, Bill, and good morning, everybody. What I want to do is look at resilience from the point of view of the program on river basin management. This program, as you see in the title, was the IUCN Water Management Initiative, which was led by IUCN over the last 10 years. And out of that program, we built up a huge body of experience, of evidence, of stories, and so on. And we set about 3 years ago or so to try and come to some sort of understanding of what all of that experience was telling us, giving us some kind of synthesis of lessons from working in river basins. And what we used to do that, we used an analysis, a framework of analysis that was based on science of complex adaptive systems, of, as Bill has pointed out, of social ecological systems. So we were trying to take the body of theory about complex systems and social ecological systems and use it to understand what had been going on over the course of many years in a set of over 30 river basin projects. And we several of us through a process of analysis, we drew a set of lessons and built up a set of principles from that. So we were able to, in the course of that work, we were able to build up an interpretation of resilience in these river basins, of resilience in practice. The focus was very much about how does this idea of resilience, this theory of complex systems, what does that look like in the real world? And out of that came a framework that we found very useful that I'm going to end up concluding with. So, any presentation on resilience starts with the definition. And I'm sure there'll be several. We already had one, and now we're going to have another. Actually, we're going to have two. And I'm sure as we go through the presentations, there will be more. So, there are, as you see on the screen here, there are quite, how can I say, technically rich definitions of resilience. Here, this one coming from the IPCC, but the basic idea, of course, is it's about being able to absorb disturbances while, in this case, retaining the same basic structure. I think a much more helpful way of looking at it is much more as a field that just outlined. So the capacity to cope with change, and in the context of the river basins where we were working, the capacity to cope with change and sustain the transformations that you need to reduce poverty under global change. But as I said, what we were really interested in is what can that help, how can that help us take practical action on the ground and build resilience in practice. The Water Nature Initiative, as I said, just to give you a picture, worked in over 30 projects around the world in a wide-ranging set of river basins. This slide simply summarizes the kinds of results that we had from all of those projects. What I want to do simply is point out that those results combine work on governance, which is the top row, at different scales. We combine work on livelihoods and economic-ish factors. We combine with work on learning, stakeholders working at a range of different levels, and of course, ecosystem management and natural resource management. So very much an interdisciplinary point of view and source of learning. So from that, we were able to build up, looking at our experiences over those years in those river basins, build up a picture of what makes for a vulnerable river basin and what makes for a resilient river basin. And what the patterns we saw, and I don't think they're really surprising, in our interpretation through that range of disciplines, is we have, in a vulnerable basin, we have weak hydrological buffering. We have typically a narrow economic and livelihood dependency. We have infrastructure, water infrastructure, that's not coping. It's not able to cope with the range of extremes in hydrological events, for example, that are present. That infrastructure is very often counterproductive in terms of buffering hydrology, but also in terms of enabling people to build livelihoods and economic development. In vulnerable basins, we see typically that vulnerable people are not empowered to take action. This is really key. We see that conflict dominates over coordination. We see that institutions are very often paralyzed. The institutions that are meant to help with development, in this case water resource management, were paralyzed and unable to do so. And in that context, we see that institutions and stakeholders have very poor access to information, and the new information and new knowledge was not easy to put into use. Whereas in resilient basins, you see a good buffering of hydrograph, you see a diverse economy and livelihoods and options for them, you see sustainable infrastructure portfolios that combine natural infrastructure and engineered infrastructure and a means to manage them in a more coordinated way, so that infrastructure supports ecosystem services while supporting also the diversification of economies. You see that vulnerable people are empowered to act. They have governance that enables self-organization. You have adaptive institutions that are set up to learn, that are set up to use new information and knowledge as it becomes available, and then to put that into use. So we end up with this picture then from this body of work of how do you enhance resilience. And so it combines working with building participation, building knowledge, building the application of rights, combined with the institutions institutional reforms at multiple levels and multiple scales that you need to put that to work. Combined also with restoration, in many of the places we're working, restoration of natural systems and the livelihoods associated with them. And people working within that sort of system, that they're empowered to take action. They're empowered also in ways that enable them to take new choices for livelihoods, develop new sorts of enterprises. And at the center of the graphic here, infrastructure playing a particularly important role and the way it's operated in terms of water management. So just two very brief illustrations of the, as I've said, of the picture of how change rolled out in these complex systems of the river basins where we were working. The first example of this sort of what we interpret as a resilience shift taking place in the KYB there is the Congo-Yobe Basin, which is a basin in northern Chad that drains into northern Nigeria that drains into Lake Chad. And on the left, you see the situation before the set of interventions, and on the right, the situation that is developing, which is not short-term processes as a result of the work that's going on there. So the situation before then, you have a case of drought, aggravated poverty. This is a place where there is very deep poverty. You have a long history of failed water infrastructure projects, irrigation projects, not meeting the expectations that they were designed for, not meeting the needs of people for building their economic well-being. You have ecological degradation and breakdown of the river system. You have rising conflict. This was the trigger for action really in this space. It was rising conflict amongst communities and amongst the different institutions. And a sense of paralysis, a really very real sense of paralysis in the basin about not being able to confront the problem. Whereas through a set of interventions able to bring about much better sharing of information amongst all stakeholders at all levels. Bringing stakeholders together to work on consensus-based plan for how you will restore this space. And so therefore knowing who needs to do what, who is responsible for what action, who can be counted on, who needs to be taking forward the different agreed aspects of management. And in that management plan, having ecosystem and livelihood restoration approaches. Working on resolving the conflict, working on formalizing the governance arrangements so that you have this participatory system that is empowering people to act. In Guatemala, also one of the other locations where we work, we see the same sort of pattern. So on the left, a situation which is very difficult for the local communities, in which they're facing ecological degradation, which is causing impairment of their livelihoods. In this case, on very steep mountain slopes of vulnerability to disaster. Whereas with the set of interventions, combining the work on empowering people, combining the work on governance and restoration of the landscapes and diversification, therefore, of farming systems that they're able to use, putting in place the kind of liaison you need between local communities and the municipal level and the provincial level of government, being able to put in place a workable system of disaster planning. So the question I like to ask myself when I look at these sorts of basins is if I'm facing climate, if I'm a community member having to contemplate climate change, having to contemplate the impacts in the case of Takana of a hurricane, which world would I rather live in? Would it be the one on the left or much more the one on the right? I think I have much more of a chance of coping if I'm living in the world on the right. So we synthesize this into this framework for resilience and practice, which is summarized here. It has, as you see, 4 components. The first component is about diversity. So we're looking at diversity in the economy and livelihoods, and in nature and biodiversity and the services that they provide. The second component we term sustainable infrastructure and technologies. So the engineering that you do needs to be sustainable, using natural infrastructure and the services that it provides, and managing in ways that are sustainable and adaptive. The third component we term self-organization, which is an important term emerging, of course, out of resilience theory and resilience science. Self-organization, which in practical terms is about participatory participatory governance. It's about having governance that empowers the right people to take the action needed, and having institutions that are adaptive. And the fourth component is about learning, that point about institutions and people and stakeholders being able to use the new knowledge and new skills as they come along. So just to wrap up there, resilient science, the science of social and ecological systems is rich, and if you like interdisciplinary work, it's a fascinating part of science. But one of the challenges that it has is how do you unlock that? How do you unlock that science and put it into practice on the ground? And we think, from our experience, is that the key to doing that is to set about learning from what works, to set about trying to apply these sorts of principles on the ground and learn about what works. So the framework that we developed from going through that process ourselves gives us a good basis for guidance about how to design and implement projects or programs that can strengthen resilience in a very practical way. So we use it in river-based management, we use it in climate change adaptation. And I think what I would like to pursue as we go through today's session is how can this sort of thinking, how can this sort of practical framework coming that brings together the science with the theory with practical experience, how can that be used to guide the way we set up policies that we reinforce resilience?
Thanks very much, Mike. I really like the concept of learning in your framework there. Next week, I'm going to call 3 speakers at once, and then we'll have the panel, so we don't run out of time. David Lamb, David's here representing the